John Coltrane was one of the pioneers of the music world, and arguably the best jazz saxophonist ever. It is believed the mere mention of the name John Coltrane is likely to evoke a deep emotional response from even the most casual jazz fan. H. Michael Sanders is one such fan.
After I graduated from college, I worked from midnight to 8 a.m. in the booth of a parking lot at a hospital in Boston, and I was making a living as a parking lot attendant while I was shopping my photography portfolio around during the daytime. And while I sat there from midnight to 8 a.m., I listened to this jazz program on the radio. And the guy who was the host of the show was incredibly knowledgeable about jazz, and he played all of the classic jazz as well as a lot of avant-garde. And I learned about jazz. I'd never really listened to it before. I was a rock and roll baby. But this guy taught me about jazz, sitting there 8 hours a night listening to him spin records. And John Coltrane was one of the first people that I really began to resonate with. And I went out and bought albums by John Coltrane's groups. And one of the things that appealed to me the most was not only the chances that he took musically, but also the overt spiritual direction that he was moving his music in. And John Coltrane was one of the artists that I listened to as I was beginning to learn what jazz was and what it was about. So it sort of always carved out a soft spot in my heart, and that's something that I always continue to go back to and still go back to when I'm looking for inspiration or looking for some kind of spiritual dimension in the music that I'm listening to.
Michael Sanders is influenced by Coltrane's music to such an extent that his respect for the great saxophonist comes across in his work. Sanders has written 3 meditations on saxophone dedicated to Coltrane's music.
Well, the long poem, Listening to Trane, evolved over a several-week period of scribbling notes and writing while I was listening to various John Coltrane records on my turntable. And I was undergoing sort of an emotional turmoil at the time. I'd fallen in love with this beautiful young woman and was like a hunter trying to catch a rabbit. I couldn't make the kill, if you will. And so I was under a lot of emotional duress during this period of time. And so part of the impetus for the poem is all of these emotions that were welling up in me because of my attraction to this young woman. But beyond that, I felt that something that was coming out of that sort of failed relationship was a reconnecting with the music that I really loved. So it really sort of evolved away quickly from the emotional turmoil about the love affair gone bad to my general sort of philosophical thinking about my situation in the world and my lack of certainty about where I was.
Michael's other influences are the beat poets Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac. Beat generations and their poetry came to prominence in the 1950s, which in turn gave birth to jazz poetry. Jazz poetry is the reciting of suitable poetry with the music of a jazz band or jazz artist. Sanders is a poet and a Coltrane fan, and so jazz poetry is an obvious passion. Unfortunately, jazz poetry seems to have lost its mojo in today's times, and so Sanders wanted to recreate the magic of the 50s.
Because I feel that there's a lot in common with the way that I wrote Listening to Trane with much of the beat poetry from the 1950s, like Jack Kerouac and certainly Allen Ginsberg's incantory styles. And that gave us a way in which we could let the video have a context that it could live in, because I think that the words themselves kind of flow in the way that a lot of the beat poetry was verbally delivered, at least in my experience of listening to them on record.
Sanders has had the dream of filming his 3-part meditation since 1983, when he penned his words on paper, but the opportunity to do so only recently presented itself. However, he had some earlier opportunities to perform his meditations live on a number of occasions.
I'd written this 3-poem cycle in 1983, and a little bit later in that year, I had the opportunity to read them at a public reading that was being done as a benefit for muscular dystrophy at a local establishment in Columbus, Ohio. And so I went down as one of the invited poets to do the live reading. And as it turns out, it was a competition, and I actually won the competition with the reading of the first section of the poem, as well as a couple of short things. In part because I think I had a saxophone player, Joel Johansson, with me, who blew behind me and helped give the thing some musical structure, as well as the music of the words. But I think that the combination of the live music and the music of the words sort of caught the audience off guard a little bit, and it made an impression at the time. And that made me very excited, because I hadn't performed a lot of my poetry in public up till that point, and began to do so more regularly following that. But I also wanted to try to perform the whole cycle, even though it was rather lengthy. And in fact, I began to develop ideas about turning it into a video.